Hey, shalom, shalom, shalom lakam, which is peace unto you all. Hi, Rob Tawab la Adam, za ach yakam yawam an Chagadol Charlotte, which is good evening. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam kaya, hamalakat hashamayim kwara, repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call halayim la la abanawa Yahweh bahasham Yahweh shai, bahasham rocha hakodash wa mashanala zakwanim nawa, wa malakam shah rocha gadol, which is all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists. Bahasham, and the name Yahweh Shai delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. This is Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 1. All right, in the subtitle it says, Made alive in Hamashayach. All right, I'm going to start at verse 1. It says, And you hath he quickened, who were dead in trespasses and sins. All right, I want to get this word for quicken. And ultimately in this lesson, I pretty much want to go into detail how the Lord Yahweh Shai is where, essentially we meet, whereas, in the curses, all right, ultimately Jake, all right, has that evil eye towards his brother, all right, essentially, where there is peace, all right, essentially we get peace in the Lord, Yahweh Shai HaMashiach, but nevertheless, continuing on, I wanted to get this word for, well, it's not in there, let me see, let's go to John chapter 6, and we'll get verse 63, and it says, It is the spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing. The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. All right, so the spirit goes back to the scriptures. It says, it is the spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing, because ultimately, Jake, all right, in the world, are, succumbing, to the curses, which, we all succumb unto the curses, but it's just that, we essentially walk better, all right, when we're, believing and conducting ourselves in the Lord Yahweh Shai, walking spiritually. All right. 2/3 Jake, they ultimately are living by the flesh. All right. So it says, It is the spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profit of nothing. The words that I speak unto you, and which it says the flesh profit of nothing, which the spirit ultimately brings us, back alive. All right. That's why I said in Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, in that subtitle, it said, made alive in Hamashayach, because it says the flesh profit of nothing, Jake has tried, everything, all right, whether it be, the Black Panther movement, whether it be, Black Lives Matter, all right, the civil rights movement, all of these didn't amount to anything. They had, their little season or whatever, but ultimately, it didn't amount to, it didn't profit anything, all right, because that wasn't ultimately, that this isn't our rest, so continuing on, it says, the words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. Ultimately, this is what allows us to live again, in which we got Ephesians, the 2nd chapter. All right, said we're made alive. That subtitle said we're made alive in Hamashayach, because that's ultimately where, all right, we meet. We meet in the Lord Yahweh Shai HaMashayach, pursuant to Isaiah, the 34th chapter and the 16th verse. I don't want to say how we get that, but I want to get this word for quicken real fast. All right, it says quicken it. It says to produce alive. It says to cause to live. It says by spiritual power to arouse and invigorate, because when, seeing Jake, all right, in the world, all right, in which, at a certain point in time, we was, living in the ways of the world, essentially, without life, living a death style. That's what the scriptures say, he that wandereth out of the way of understanding shall remain in the congregation of the dead. So ultimately, in the congregation of the dead, it entails a misery, all right, sorrow, all right, a state of being lost, all right, no type of direction, no type of purpose, all right. The Lord Yahweh Shai ultimately gives us a sense of purpose, all right, and we ultimately become one, all right, in the Lord Yahweh Shai. That's why going into that precept, he pretty much broke down the middle wall of partition, roughly paraphrasing Ephesians, the 2nd chapter. I believe it's the 14th verse. But let's go back. Let's get let me get Colossians chapter 3, and let me see. This is Colossians chapter 3, and I get verse 4. It says, when Hamashayach, who is our life, shall appear, then shall ye also appear with him in glory. Verse 5, it says, mortify your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. It says, for which things sake the wrath of the Most High cometh on the children of disobedience. All right, it says, in which ye also walked some time when ye lived in them, because at a certain point in time, we was conducting ourselves, all right, in the ways of the world. All right, so essentially, we're to put on, the new creature in Yahweh Shai, Hamashayach, which ultimately is going to entail of essentially living, because pursuant to the curses, essentially it's a death style. All right, it causes for confusion, envy. All right, hating your brother. All right, which when we come into this truth, essentially the scriptures say, to love your neighbor as yourself. So ultimately, again, that's peace. All right, that's how the scriptures say, come to me come to me all that are heavy laden, and I shall give thee rest. Ultimately we find rest in the Lord Yahweh Shai Hamashayach, and that's because ultimately he's bringing us back together. Whereas when you have two a part of the same household, all right, if they're not on the same accord, it's gonna be division. That's gonna be it's gonna be weak. All right, but when two come together in strength, ultimately, that shows strength because they're operating as one. That's why Baha'u'llah Bayath. All right, the first letter Baha'u'llah Bayath is Ah. All right, it means strength. All right, one. Because when we're conducting ourselves as one, that's ultimately how that's how we're strong. All right. So bear with me. Give me a second. I'm looking for a precept. I'm gonna go back to Ephesians chapter 2. I'll start back at verse 1. It says, and you hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins, where in time past ye walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit now that worketh in the children of disobedience. So at a certain point in time, essentially we was conducting ourselves in the ways of the heathen. All right, I'm gonna skip down to verse 14. It says, for he is our peace. All right, I'm starting verse 13. It says, but now in Hamashayach Yahweh Shai, ye who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Hamashayach. Because we believe on the Lord Yahweh Shai, so ultimately, we're made close unto the Lord Yahweh, because Yahweh Shai is that mediator. Verse 14, it says, for he is our peace, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us. All right, because scriptures essentially detail Yahweh Shai as that cornerstone. All right, and which it says, this word for partition, it says a hedge, a fence, that which separates, prevents two from coming together. Because ultimately, pursuant to the curses, Jake is in a divided type of mindset. That's why Jake, is in the gangs. Jake is essentially, Jake will see, another Jake out in public, and immediately, they have a mindset of hatred. All right. So I'm gonna also get this because this ultimately went into the same thing as well. I'm gonna get this word for cornerstone. All right, this is the word for cornerstone, and it says place at an extreme corner, the corner foundation stone. All right, so it says for as the cornerstone holds together two walls, so Hamashayach joins together as, which that word should be Israelites. All right, first and foremost the elect, into one body dedicated to the Most High. It says those who were formerly Jews, which that will be the circumcision. It says and Gentiles, because the Gentiles are talking about the Israelite foreigners, because at a certain point in time, Jake ultimately, Jake was scattered across the four corners of the globe, in which we are ultimately brought together by the Lord Yahweh Shai. All right, so it says, continuing on, it says, and as a cornerstone contributes to sustain the edifice, let me get this word for edifice. Edifice means a building. So it says, and as a cornerstone contributes to sustain the edifice. So we're essentially sustained by the Lord Yahweh Shai. It says, nevertheless, but nevertheless, some fall in going around the corner carelessly. They not these are the ones that's not being cognizant of how they're building. They're essentially trying to find some other way. That represents the false prophets, are and those is not in the correct spirit. So it says some are built up by the aid of Hamashayach, while others stumbling at Hamashayach perish. All right, those are essentially that Proverbs 1:32 type of spirit, where they had they found other ways beneficial. They found making their own way beneficial. You see, so in doing so, by default, they're gonna perish. All right. So I'm gonna see what this says real fast. Going back to Ephesians, I'm gonna get one more and that'll be it. But this is Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 20. It says, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Yahweh Shai HaMashiach himself being the chief cornerstone, in which something about the chief cornerstone, the rest of the building follows. It follows the blueprint, or it follows the building of that cornerstone, So ultimately that's us in the spirit, to where, we have to follow the Lord Yahweh Shai, because he's a trailblazer. We have to take the straight gate. All right, so it says, in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto a holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are builded together for an habitation of the Most High through the Spirit. So, all right, it was how you had the first temple, all right, which it was a physical temple. All right, you had the second temple, all right, which that was a physical temple, you see, but the third temple is a spiritual temple, all right, which consists of the elect, all right, the believers. All right, so it says, in whom all the, verse 21, Ephesians 2 and 21, it says, in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto an holy temple in the Lord. All right, that third temple. All right, so let's get this and that'll be it. This is Isaiah Yashaya chapter 34 and verse 16, because again, pursuant to the curses, Jake is essentially in that divided type of mindset. Jake is divided on all fronts. All right. Jake will look down upon another Jake, because of, where they come from, their background. All right. How they talk. All right. Off the, carnal means, Jake don't be looking in the spirit, because ultimately it goes back to the curses. But essentially, again, we're gathered, all right, by the Lord Yahweh Shai. All right. This is Isaiah 34 and 16. It says, seek ye out of the book of the Lord and read. No one of these shall fail. All right, talking about the prophecies. All right, it was written that we would sin and go off. All right, we had the curses placed upon us. All right, we'd be kicked out of the Holy Land. You see, now the Lord is in the process of essentially gathering the nation back together, starting with the elect. 2/3 they get their rest in the kingdom. But it says, no one of these shall fail. None shall want her mate, because the scriptures don't have a mate. These all philosophies, the doctrines, and the books that come out of those doctrines. All right, they don't go into prophecy. All right, and if it has something that's mentioned in a prophecy, they got it from the scriptures. All right, so it says, none shall want her mate, for my mouth it hath commanded, and his spirit it hath gathered them. The elect was gathered, all right, by this truth. All right, which again, was the Lord Yahweh Shai. The Lord Yahweh Shai essentially, by the scriptures, essentially gathered the nation of Israel. All right, essentially, taking down that partition, which essentially is representative, of the curses. All right, and which first and foremost, the elect, the elect is being gathered on this side, So I just wanted to go into that. Adawan Tazaza Banayapa. Lord's will, that was a beautiful edification through the spirit. Adawan Tazah Atam Yashlai Tawab. Lord's will, you have a good night. Wa shalom lakam, which is peace unto you all. Shalom, shalom.